The wind carved its ancient song across the rim of Thunder Mesa, where red stone sentinels had watched over sacred ground since time beyond memory. Below in the canyon's embrace, three figures huddled against a world that seemed determined to claim their lives: a white woman, whose auburn hair whipped like flame in the bitter gusts, a young Lakota warrior, whose dark eyes never ceased their vigilant scanning, and an old man, whose every breath was a victory stolen from approaching death. Eliza Hartwell pressed her back against the fallen cottonwood that served as their meager shelter, feeling the rope burns at her wrists throb with each heartbeat. 3 days of freedom, and still her body bore the marks of Vernon Pike's generosity, that peculiar hospitality extended to those who found themselves in debt to his various enterprises. The welts had begun to heal, but the memory of chains would linger longer than scars. She lifted the wooden spoon toward the old warrior's lips, watching him struggle to accept even this thin sustenance. Old Crow Wicasa, to his people, had seen 68 winters pass over these sacred hills. His weathered hands trembled not with age, but with the pneumonia that filled his chest like thick river mud. Yet his eyes remained sharp as obsidian blades, tracking every shadow that moved in the scrub below. "Please," Eliza whispered, though whether she spoke to the dying man or to whatever spirits might be listening, she couldn't say. The broth was barely more than hot water flavored with strips of jerky, but it was warm, and warmth was life in this merciless country. 10 paces away, Red Hawk Orenda, in the tongue of his fathers, maintained his watch from behind a boulder that wouldn't stop a determined child, much less the professional killers who circled them like vultures sensing death. The scar that traced from his left temple to the corner of his mouth caught the fading light, a pale reminder of cavalry steel and choices that couldn't be unmade. His Spencer carbine never wavered from the riders below, though Eliza noticed how his free hand occasionally drifted to the knife at his belt and the blade that had tasted the blood of Deputy Morton just hours before. Lightning flickered in the western peaks, followed by thunder that spoke of storms racing across the high country with the fury of avenging angels. The air grew heavy, making Old Crow's breathing even more labored. Each flash illuminated the canyon walls in stark detail, revealing the positions of Pike's men and the narrow paths that might offer escape to the desperate or the foolish. A muzzle flash bloomed in the mesquite below. The bullet struck stone inches from Eliza's shoulder, showering her torn dress with fragments of red rock. She pressed closer to Old Crow, shielding his frail form with her own body, and felt something pass between them, a recognition that transcended language and blood, the understanding that she had chosen to stand with him when standing meant sharing his danger. Orenda's answer came swift and sure. The Spencer boomed, and one of the circling riders tumbled from his saddle in a spray of dust and crimson. His horse galloped toward the distant hills with empty stirrups, and the remaining gunmen took cover behind boulders and thorny brush. "Keep feeding him," Orenda said without taking his eye from the rifle sight. His English carried the careful precision of someone who had learned the white man's tongue from missionaries and traders, but his tone held the unmistakable authority of a war leader, born not made. Eliza didn't waste breath on screams. Months under Pike's brutal supervision had taught her that silence was survival, that drawing attention from dangerous men was often the last mistake a person ever made. She tightened her grip on the spoon and continued the delicate works of keeping Old Crow alive, one spoonful at a time. The thin broth barely qualified as nourishment, but it was liquid and salt. And Old Crow's fevered body needed both to keep his ancient heart beating. His throat worked slowly, fighting the congestion that threatened to drown him from within. Each swallow was a small victory against the illness that tried to claim him before he could see his beloved Thunder Mesa one final time. Another shot cracked from below, closer now. The ricochet sent all three of them pressing lower against the stone. Orenda shifted position, his hand briefly closing over Eliza's forearm to guide her into better cover. The contact was brief, but electric, warm, steady, reassuring despite the chaos surrounding them. Stay low. He breathed close enough that she could smell the sage he chewed and the gunpowder that clung to his clothes like smoke from a ceremonial fire. When their eyes met in the dim light, something passed between them that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the growing awareness that this man had become more than an ally of convenience. He checked Old Crow's pulse with practiced fingers pressing against the old warrior's neck, where paper-thin skin revealed the flutter of life beneath. The heartbeat was weak but steady, fighting against pneumonia with the stubbornness that had carried him through decades of warfare and survival. "He's holding on," Orenda said. And in those 3 words lay a recognition that they were no longer strangers thrown together by chance. They had become something more fundamental, a family forged in the crucible of mutual need and shared enemies. The second rider below had taken position behind a cluster of barrel cactus, his rifle barrel glinting in the last rays of sunlight. Orenda counted his remaining cartridges, by feel his fingers moving across the brass shells with automatic precision. 8 left. After that harsh language and sharp sticks. 8 left. He murmured more to himself than to his companions. Despite everything, the cold that bit through her torn dress, the danger that circled them like a living thing, and the weight of a dying man in her care, Eliza felt her mouth twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I've got plenty of harsh language saved up." For a moment, something passed between them in the gathering darkness, a recognition that they were both fighters, both survivors who had learned to find humor in the face of death. In Orenda's dark eyes, she saw admiration mixed with something deeper, something that made her heart race despite their mortal peril. Old Crow stirred between them, his weathered hand, finding Eliza's wrist with surprising strength. When he spoke, it was in a voice like wind through autumn leaves waste. "Good." The simple word carried more weight than elaborate praise recognition from a warrior whose approval had been earned through action rather than words. Thunder rolled from the western peaks closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall on stone that had been baking in the sun all day. Steam rose from the rocks like departing spirits, and the approaching storm would complicate everything, reducing visibility, making footing treacherous, washing away tracks that might confuse their pursuers. "Storm coming," Orenda observed, reading the signs with the expertise of a man who had spent his life in wild country. "Need shelter before it hits, or the cold will finish what the bullet started." Old Crow's eyes opened fully for the first time in hours, focusing on the darkening sky with awareness that transcended his physical weakness. "Home hills?" he whispered in English, his voice carrying longing that cut through the wind like a knife. Before the drums, before they stopped calling to an old warrior's heart. If they listened carefully past the wind and gunfire, they could hear it, the faint but unmistakable rhythm of hide drums echoing from Thunder Mesa, 20 miles to the north. The sound was barely perceptible, more felt than heard, but it carried a message every Lakota warrior understood: the people were calling one of their own to come home before it was too late. 3 days earlier, in the hour before dawn, when shadows held their deepest secrets, Eliza had pressed herself against the rough planks of Pike's overseer office, her heart hammering as she worked to pry loose a crucial floorboard. The labor camp sprawled across an alkali flat, like a wound in the earth, canvas tents and ramshackle buildings where Vernon Pike kept his indentured workers trapped by debt threat, the vast emptiness of the surrounding country. The morning air carried unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and the metallic tang of ore dust that settled on everything like despair made manifest. Guards patrolled the perimeter with casual brutality, men who had learned that violence was the most efficient means of maintaining order among people who had nothing left to lose except their lives. Her husband, Walter, had perished in the previous winter's blizzard, caught in a whiteout while checking their small herd. when spring's thaw had revealed his frozen body twisted around a fence post like a scarecrow made of ice and bone. Vernon Pike had appeared at her door, like a raven drawn to carrion. He'd brought papers claiming Walter owed substantial sums, documents bearing official seals and legal language that might as well have been ancient Greek. But Pike had owned the local sheriff, controlled the territorial judge, and commanded enough hired guns to make resistance suicidal. She'd found herself bound to work off phantom debt at his various enterprises, her labor valued at barely enough to cover room and board, while the supposed debt grew larger each month through interest and administrative fees that appeared with the regularity of seasons. That morning, after enduring Pike's latest generous offer to reduce her obligations in exchange for sharing his bed, Eliza had made her choice. The proposition had been delivered with cultured politeness, but the threat beneath his words had been unmistakable. Freedom or death, there would be no middle ground. Her woman's intuition and a rancher's wife's practical knowledge told her that Pike's locked ledgers contained more than simple business records. She'd noticed the meetings after dark, conducted in whispers that ceased whenever she approached. Supply wagons came and went from the Quicksilver mine at irregular hours, their contents covered by tarps. Certain ledger entries were written in codes that didn't match any legitimate business practice she'd ever seen. The floorboard had finally yielded, revealing a cavity that held exactly what she'd hoped to find: ledgers bound in oiled leather, and a tobacco tin filled with small metal discs that gleamed dully in the lamplight. The assay tags bore dates, weights, initials that meant nothing to her, but might mean everything to someone with knowledge to interpret them. But as she'd reached deeper into the hiding place, her fingers had encountered something else: the charred remains of what appeared to be official correspondence. Most of the document had been consumed by fire, leaving only fragments of heavy paper with embossed letterhead that spoke of government authority. Through the damaged text, she could make out partial phrases that made her pulse quicken. Federal Surveyor Authority and Congressional Endorsement Secured, followed by what looked like Pike's name, though the letters were too damaged to be certain. The implications had been staggering. If Pike was connected to some federal surveying operation, then the scope of his influence extended far beyond what she'd imagined. But the document was too damaged to provide clear answers, leaving her with more questions than certainty. There had to be someone in authority she could trust, someone beyond Pike's reach who could act on the evidence she'd discovered. What had made her hands shake was the correlation between dates in the ledgers and mysterious payments marked BJ. Amounts far too large for legitimate expenses and far too regular to be coincidental. Someone was being paid substantial sums for work Pike didn't want recorded in official company books. She'd stuffed the evidence into a grain sack, including the charred document fragments, and slipped away through a hole she'd been carefully widening in her tent wall for weeks. The escape route led through a drainage ditch so foul that guards avoided patrolling it. By the time the morning bell rang to summon workers to their daily labors, she was 3 miles away, and climbing into broken country where tracking would be difficult, even for professional manhunters. That was where Orenda had found her, pressed into the meager shade of a cholla, with her water nearly gone, and her hands lacerated from trying to dig for roots in rocky soil. She'd expected hostility from any Lakota warrior, given the territorial newspaper stories about raids and conflicts. Instead, he'd approached slowly with hands visible, speaking first in his own language, then in careful English. "You are far from water," he'd observed, studying her torn dress and desperate condition with eyes that missed nothing. "Both of those things are true," she'd replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. He'd offered jerky and water without asking for explanations or payment. The jerky was seasoned with unfamiliar spices that spoke of culinary traditions she'd never encountered, while the water tasted of sage and mountain springs. When she'd shown him the contents of the tobacco tin, his expression had hardened into something carved from surrounding stone. "These marks," he'd said, holding one assay tag up to catch the light. "They show ore taken from land that belongs to my people. Land promised by treaty, stolen by men with papers that lie like forked tongues." "Funikak, can you prove that?" she'd asked, though she suspected the answer would involve courts and judges who had already demonstrated their willingness to favor Pike's interests. "Not in white man's courts," he'd replied with bitter accuracy. "But these might speak loud enough for even deaf judges to hear if they reach the right hands." That was how their alliance had begun, two people with nothing left to lose, joining forces against enemies who seemed to possess everything. But Orenda hadn't been traveling alone. His companion Old Crow had been resting in the shade of a distant mesa, already weakened by illness, but still possessed of dignity and wisdom that had made him a respected leader among his people. "My mother's uncle," Orenda had explained as they'd approached the old warrior's temporary camp. "Last of the war leaders who remembers the old ways. He's been asking to see the sacred places one more time before the Great Spirit calls him to ride the Star Trail." He hadn't needed to finish. Old Crow's condition had been obvious, the waxen pallor that spoke of systems shutting down, the labored breathing that marked lungs filling with fluid. But his eyes had remained bright with intelligence and hope, as if the arrival of unexpected allies had given him reason to fight a little longer. The old warrior had studied the assay tags with careful attention, examining each disc individually. When he'd finally spoken, it had been in English clear enough for all to understand. "These show theft," he'd said simply. "But more than theft, they show the heart of a man who would devour the earth itself and leave only emptiness for the children yet unborn." From there, their bargain had taken shape naturally. Eliza needed to reach Crow's Landing, where she hoped a federal surveyor might be honest enough to act on her evidence, someone with authority that extended beyond Pike's local influence. Orenda needed to get Old Crow to Thunder Mesa, where the old warrior could die among his own people. Both journeys lay in the same direction, and both travelers faced the same enemies. But they hadn't been the only ones opposed to Pike's expanding empire. At a small school housed in a converted barn, Miss Genevieve Hartwell, no relation, despite their shared surname, had been sheltering Lakota children whose parents had been arrested on trumped-up charges. A woman of 40, with steel-gray hair and fierce determination. She'd recognized the broader pattern behind what appeared to be random harassment. "They're clearing the natives to make room for railroad development," she'd explained while children played in her carefully tended garden. "The cavalry arrests the adults on whatever charges they can fabricate. The children are placed in government custody, and mysteriously, the land becomes available for development by Pike's associates." She'd pressed a carefully written note into Eliza's hands, sealed with wax, and addressed to Dr. Franklin in town. "He needs to know what's happening. The railroad deputies are planning something larger than isolated arrests." Dr. Franklin had proven exactly the ally they'd needed, a man whose medical training had taught him to see patterns others missed, and whose experience had given him courage to act on convictions. Around 55, with gentle hands and shrewd eyes, he'd examined Old Crow in his small office movements, quick and efficient despite primitive conditions. But what had struck Eliza as odd was how he'd checked his pocket watch during the examination, an expensive piece that seemed far too fine for a frontier physician's income, engraved with initials that didn't match his name. "Family heirloom," he'd explained when he'd noticed her attention. But something in his eyes suggested the explanation wasn't entirely truthful. The watch had disappeared back into his vest with practiced movement that spoke of habitual concealment. "Pneumonia," he'd diagnosed after listening to Old Crow's chest. "Advanced but not necessarily fatal if he can rest and stay warm. The real danger is if he gets chilled or exhausted, that could push him over the edge quickly. As Franklin had prepared his treatment, Eliza had watched with growing curiosity. He'd produced a small brown bottle from his medical bag, carefully measuring drops of what appeared to be carbolic acid solution, a disinfectant she'd heard mentioned in connection with military hospitals, but had never seen used by frontier physicians. The sharp, medicinal smell was unlike anything in her experience of rural medicine. Speaking of training and resources that seemed incongruous with his modest practice. Carbolic acid, he'd explained when he'd noticed her attention. New development in antiseptic practice. Learned it from medical journals. Bored, but his hesitation suggested there was more to the story than professional reading. He'd provided laudanum for pain and detailed instructions for care, but more importantly, he'd offered information about the broader conspiracy they were facing. "Pike's not just stealing ore," Franklin had said while preparing medicine bottles. "He's financing something bigger with those profits. Word is he's planning to blast the riverbank up at Devil's Tooth Channel the spring melt to flood out every homestead and native camp in the valley." The conversation had been interrupted by the arrival of Hugh and Nora Camden hardscrabble farmers, whose land lay directly in Pike's planned flood path. Hugh was built like a fence post and twice as stubborn hands, scarred by decades of wrestling sustenance from reluctant soil, while his wife Nora possessed the quiet strength frontier women needed to survive in country that killed the weak without mercy. "We've been fighting Pike's fences for 2 years," Hugh had explained while his wife packed supplies. "Every time we cut his illegal wire, he sends more men to string it back up. But if what you're saying is true about the flood..." As they'd prepared to leave Willow Springs under cover of darkness, Old Crow had insisted on speaking privately with each of his companions. To Orenda, he'd given directions in rapid Lakota that had brought tears to the younger man's eyes, guidance about sacred places and ancient paths, but also about responsibilities that would fall to him once his uncle was gone. To Eliza, he'd offered something more precious than gold, recognition and respect from a man whose approval had been earned through actions rather than words. "You carry great burden," he'd said, his English still precise despite weakness. "But the heart that knows sorrow can also know great joy, and the spirit that has walked through darkness can guide others toward the light." "How can you tell?" she'd asked, genuinely curious. "Because you still fight when fighting seems hopeless." He'd replied with a slight smile that transformed his weathered features. "That is the mark of one whose soul has been tempered by both fire and ice, and emerges stronger than either alone could make it." The ford at Ash River had seemed like Providence. In the gathering dusk, a natural crossing where water ran shallow over smooth stones flanked by cottonwoods that provided both concealment and windbreak. Old Crow had been struggling to stay upright in his saddle the day's travel, having sapped what little strength the laudanum hadn't already stolen. They'd made camp in a grove set back from the bank where trees would hide their fire, and moving water would mask quiet conversations from any listeners tracking their movements. Eliza had cooked thin stew from Orenda's jerky and wild onions, and she'd gathered, surprised to find that hardship had sharpened rather than dulled her appetite. The simple meal had tasted better than any feast from her former life, seasoned with honest sweat and the satisfaction of freedom earned through courage. Old Crow had managed several spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed him, leaving him wrapped in blankets and breathing with the irregular rhythm of deep illness. Watching him sleep, Eliza had been struck by the dignity he maintained even in weakness, the way he bore suffering without complaint. "He's holding steady," Orenda had said, checking his uncle's pulse. "But we can't push him like this much longer. Every mile takes something out of him that we can't give back." The growing intimacy between Eliza and Orenda had developed naturally during their quiet conversations, by firelight, born from proximity and shared danger, but deepened by recognition of compatible spirits. When he'd looked at her across the flames, she'd felt her heart quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. His presence made her feel protected without being diminished, valued without being possessed. "How far to Thunder Mesa?" she'd asked, cleaning their dishes in the stream while keeping watch for movement on the far bank. "2 days if we travel fast, 4 if we go careful," he'd replied grimly. At this pace, with Uncle getting weaker every hour. He hadn't needed to finish. They all understood that Old Crow was dying by degrees, and rough travel was accelerating his decline with every mile. But stopping meant capture, and capture meant death for all of them. The situation allowed no room for sentiment. They had to keep moving or die. That was when the lantern had appeared on the far bank, bobbing through darkness like a will-o'-the-wisp seeking souls to claim. At first, Eliza had thought it might be another traveler seeking the ford. But something about the way the light moved, deliberate searching, had sent ice water through her veins. She'd backed toward their camp without taking her eyes off the light, wet hands dripping cold water. The night air carried sounds that spoke of organized activity. The creak of leather, jingle of spurs, low murmur of voices discussing tactics. These were professional manhunters, conducting business they didn't want to witness. Orenda had already noticed and was reaching for his Spencer movement smooth despite tension that radiated from his frame like heat from a forge. Old Crow had somehow sensed danger, even in his weakened state, and was pushing himself up on one elbow, eyes bright with alertness that came from a lifetime of warfare. Voices had carried across the water too distant for individual words, but close enough to convey tone and intention. These were hard men conducting business they didn't want, witness professionals who had learned to communicate through gestures and abbreviated phrases. Then had come a sound that made Eliza's blood congeal, the distinctive hiss and sizzle of hot iron being plunged into water. Someone was heating a branding iron in their campfire, and there was only one reason to bring such a tool to a manhunt. Pike's men weren't content to simply kill their quarry. They intended to mark them first, to leave a message that would terrify others who might consider similar resistance. 60 yards. Orenda had whispered, voice barely audible above flowing water. His eyes had been fixed on the distant light, while his hands checked his rifle, ensuring cartridges were properly seated. Eliza's fingers had found the tobacco tin, almost unconsciously clutching evidence that had started this deadly chase. The metal felt cold despite the warm night air, a reminder that what she carried could destroy lives as easily as save them. The first shot had come without warning, a muzzle flash, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle that echoed off canyon walls. The bullet had grazed Eliza's shoulder, tearing through her dress and drawing a line of fire across her skin. She'd gasped, but hadn't screamed. Months under Pike's supervision had taught her that noise brought more attention from dangerous men. Down. Orenda had barked, shoving her behind the fallen log that became their primary cover. His touch had sent an electric thrill through her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with growing attraction that neither had acknowledged but both felt. "Crawl toward the bank," he'd ordered, pressing his cartridge belt into her hands. "If I go down, keep pressure on Uncle's chest where the sickness sits hardest. Don't let him drown in his own fluid." Instead of following his own advice about seeking cover, Orenda had done something that had taken Eliza's breath away, with its calculated courage and reckless nobility. He'd sprinted directly toward the river, drawing fire away from camp and toward himself, trusting in speed and surprise to carry him through what seemed like certain death. His boots had splashed in shallows as bullets whined overhead, some striking so close that spray from their impact had soaked his clothes. While he'd engaged their attackers in running firefight among the cottonwoods, using trees for cover, while returning fire with deadly accuracy, Eliza had focused on keeping Old Crow alive. The old warrior had been fully conscious despite weakness. his eyes bright with alertness. His hands had been steady as he'd helped her drag him toward better cover. "Can you move, Uncle?" she'd asked, using the term of respect that had come naturally. He'd nodded once, a gesture that had cost considerable effort, but conveyed absolute determination. Together, they'd crawled toward a fissure in the limestone bank that Orenda had identified as potential shelter, a natural fortification that would provide protection from rifle fire while offering a commanding view of the ford. Getting Old Crow into the narrow space had required all of Eliza's strength and most of his remaining reserves. She'd dragged him by his shoulders, feeling how light he'd become, how illness had consumed muscle and fat, until only will and bone remained. But once they'd been pressed together in the cramped refuge, she'd felt something unexpected, a sense of partnership that transcended their desperate circumstances. "Your nephew," she'd said, indicating Orenda's position as he'd continued his deadly game among the trees. "He fights like he has something worth protecting." All warriors fight better when they carry more than their own lives in their hearts. Old Crow had replied in carefully measured English. "The question is not whether a man will fight, but what sacred fire burns within him when the darkness closes in. My nephew fights for honor, for promises made to dying relatives, for a woman whose courage has awakened something in his spirit that was sleeping." The last observation had been delivered with a slight smile that suggested the old warrior saw more than his companions realized. More shots had echoed from across the river, answered by the distinctive boom of Orenda's Spencer as he'd made every cartridge count. She'd heard a cry of pain from the attacker's position, followed by cursing, and the sound of horses splashing through the ford as Pike's men had abandoned stealth for direct assault. Orenda had returned to their position at a crouch, his face bloody from a near miss that had showered him with rock chips. A bullet had passed close enough to split his lower lip, and when he'd pressed his back against hers in the narrow cleft, she'd tasted copper when he'd spoken. 4 men, maybe 5. He'd reported, automatically checking ammunition while keeping watch on their approaches. Professional gunmen, not farm boys playing at war. They know what they're doing, and they won't give up easy. The Badlands above Dusty Forks stretched before them like a nightmare landscape carved by some mad god's fury, twisted spires of red sandstone rising from alkaline flats like fingers of buried giants arroyos that could hide an army or become death traps depending on weather and thorny vegetation that seemed designed to tear flesh from bone. Old Crow had rallied somewhat during the night's rest, cool air and brief respite having eased his breathing enough that he could sit his horse without constant support. But Eliza could see the toll their flight was taking. His skin had taken on waxy pallor that spoke of systems shutting down, and his hands shook with more than fatigue when he gripped the saddle horn. The weather had been building since dawn, starting with scattered clouds that had gradually thickened into the kind of storm front that could transform the high desert from merely inhospitable to actively lethal. Air pressure was dropping, making Old Crow's breathing even more labored, while wind carried the scent of rain and ozone that spoke of lightning and flash floods. "How much farther?" she'd asked Orenda as they'd studied the maze of canyons that lay between them and Thunder Mesa, the sacred mountain barely visible through haze and heat shimmer. "Half a day to reach the sacred places," he'd replied. But his expression had been troubled as he'd studied approaching weather. "Problem is, there's only one good trail through this country, and it passes right by Copper Gulch." Pike's mining operation, she'd said, understanding immediately why that presented difficulties. "More than that," Orenda had explained. "It's where they process the stolen ore, where they store explosives for the riverbank job, and where they coordinate with corrupt officials who make it all possible. Going around adds 2 days to our journey, and Uncle doesn't have 2 days." Old Crow had heard enough of their conversation to understand the dilemma, despite fever that clouded his thoughts. With enormous effort, he'd straightened in his saddle and spoken in English that carried the authority of his younger years. "We go through." He decided, his words carrying finality that brooked no argument. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the spark that guides the feet through the darkest valley. The straight path is sometimes the only path for those who walk with the spirits of their ancestors. The approach through the Badlands had been a test of endurance that pushed all three travelers beyond their physical limits. The narrow trail wound between towering spires that channeled wind into howling gusts, capable of knocking a horse off its feet, while loose shale made every step treacherous for animals already exhausted by days of hard travel. But the greatest danger had come from an unexpected source, the weather itself, which had finally unleashed its fury when they were most vulnerable. What had begun as scattered clouds had developed into a full-scale blizzard that struck with sudden fury, characteristic of high country storms, transforming visibility from miles to mere yards, while driving snow made the already treacherous footing potentially lethal. "Shelter!" Orenda had shouted over howling wind, pointing toward what appeared to be a dark opening in the canyon wall, barely visible through swirling snow that turned the world into whirling chaos. "Cave ahead, we can wait it out if we can reach it before we freeze." The struggle to reach shelter had been a nightmare of ice-wind desperation. Old Crow had nearly been swept from his saddle by a gust that sent him sliding sideways, until Eliza had grabbed his arm and hauled him back upright, her muscles screaming with the effort. Her fingers had been numb with cold within minutes, making it difficult to maintain her grip on reins while guiding her horse through snow that was accumulating with alarming speed. The cave had been deeper than it had appeared from outside, extending back into the mesa with passages that disappeared into absolute darkness. But the main chamber had been large enough for their horses and dry enough to provide genuine refuge from the storm that continued to rage outside with undiminished fury. "How long do these storms last?" Eliza had asked, while they'd worked to build a fire from buffalo chips and sage. "Sometimes hours, sometimes days." Orenda had replied grimly, studying the cave entrance where snow continued to swirl. "In country like this, weather can trap you for a week or kill you in minutes. We'll know which when we see how much snow is on the ground when it stops." Old Crow had been weakening visibly during their fight through the storm, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as cold and exertion had taken their toll on lungs already compromised by illness. But as they'd settled around their small fire, he'd managed to speak in English that carried a note of satisfaction despite his obvious distress. "Good place," he'd said, tracing symbols with a trembling finger that spoke of hunts and ceremonies, births and deaths. "Sacred place. The spirits of those who came before dwell in stone like this, and they will shelter those whose hearts carry no shadow of evil intent." The storm had raged for 18 hours, and as the hours passed in the warm sanctuary of the cave, something profound had settled between Eliza and Orenda, a quiet understanding that transcended the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. Old Crow had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep, his breathing steady but labored, leaving them alone beside the dying fire. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but complete, filled with the whisper of wind through stone and the occasional crackle of burning buffalo chips. It was Eliza who finally broke the quiet, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if Walter felt the cold," she said, staring into the flames. "When the blizzard took him, whether he was afraid or if it was just peaceful at the end." The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to speak of such things, hadn't realized the thought had been circling in her mind like a carrion bird. But in this place with this man, it seemed natural to voice the fears that had haunted her dreams. Orenda was quiet for so long, she thought he hadn't heard her or had chosen not to respond. Then, without looking at her, He spoke in a voice soft as prayer. I had a younger sister. He said, his fingers absently working a piece of sage into smaller fragments. Small as a bird, quick as water. She died of the spotted sickness when I was away hunting. I came home to find her already walking the star trail. He paused, the sage falling in tiny pieces between his fingers. For the longest time, I was angry that I wasn't there, that she had to cross over alone. Eliza felt her throat tighten, understanding the weight of such absence, such helplessness. What changed? Old Crow told me that the spirits of those we love are never alone, even in their final moments. That love itself becomes a bridge between the world of the living and the world beyond. His dark eyes found hers across the fire. Your husband knew he was loved. That knowledge would have been with him even in the storm. The simple truth of it settled over her like a blanket, warming places in her heart that had been cold for months. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and they sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower. When the cold began to creep in, Orenda quietly added more fuel to the flames, then settled his blanket around both their shoulders without comment or fanfare. Their hands rested on the stone between them, and when her fingers unconsciously sought warmth, they found his. Neither moved away. The touch was as natural as breathing, as necessary as the fire that kept the darkness at bay. When they'd finally emerged into brilliant sunshine, reflecting off fresh snow that transformed the landscape into a crystal wonderland, something had changed between them. Not spoken, but understood. They were no longer just allies in a desperate flight. They had become something more precious and rare. Two souls who had seen each other's deepest wounds and chosen to stay close, despite the dangers such intimacy represented. The ambush had been waiting at Devil's Backbone, a narrow ridge that connected two mesas across a 1,000-foot drop, where eagles nested, and only the bravest or most desperate dared to travel. It was exactly the kind of terrain professional manhunters would choose no way around, limited maneuverability, and perfect fields of fire for riflemen positioned on heights where they could command every approach. Blackjack Sloan had planned the trap with military precision, positioning his men to create crossfire that would make escape seem impossible while leaving himself multiple avenues of retreat if the situation turned against him. But what none of them had expected was the way Old Crow's intimate knowledge of the country would provide options that weren't visible to those unfamiliar with ancient paths that connected sacred places. As they'd approached the narrow passage, Eliza had overheard a heated exchange between Sloan and Deputy Morton that had carried clearly across the stone-walled canyon. "I don't take orders from badge-wearing lapdogs." Sloan had snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "Pike pays me to do a job, not to listen to some jumped-up deputy who thinks his tin star makes him important." Morton's response had been equally venomous. "Mr. Pike values loyalty above all else, Sloan. Those who serve faithfully are rewarded. Those who question authority, well, they find themselves expendable." The threat had been unmistakable, and even from a distance, Eliza had seen Sloan's hand drift toward his gun. Pike himself had appeared from behind a boulder, his cultured voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Gentlemen, please. We have business to conduct. Mr. Sloan, your reputation precedes you, but so does your tendency toward independence. Deputy Morton represents my interests in this matter. I trust you'll extend him the respect his position deserves." The way Pike had sided with Morton while simultaneously insulting Sloan's independence had been calculated to sting. Eliza had watched the outlaw leader's face darken with barely controlled rage, his pride clearly wounded by the public rebuke. The seeds of resentment had been planted, though none of them could have predicted how they would eventually flower. "Hold there." Morton had called from ahead, his badge glinting in harsh sunlight, as he'd blocked the trail with 5 mounted men whose weapons were already drawn. Behind them, more rifles had appeared on canyon rims, barrels trained on the narrow path where escape seemed impossible. "Miss Hartwell, you're wanted for questioning regarding theft of company property." Morton had continued trying to maintain pretense of legal authority, even while conducting highway robbery disguised as law enforcement. "The Indians are wanted in connection with recent disturbances in the territory." But Old Crow had been studying terrain with eyes that had learned to read signs invisible to others, seeing possibilities in rock formations and ancient paths carved by generations of his people seeking routes through impossible country. In a voice barely audible to his companions, he'd begun speaking in Lakota, pointing with subtle gestures toward features in the rock face that might provide alternative routes. "Uncle sees another way," Orenda had translated quietly. "Dangerous, but possible for those who trust in the spirit's protection. Ledge follows fault in rock face around ambush point." The escape route Old Crow had identified was a ledge so narrow it was barely visible, a natural pathway that followed a geological fault around the ambush point, invisible to casual observation, but known to those who had learned the country's secrets through generations of careful study. It would require dismounting and leading their horses single file along a path where one slip would mean certain death. But it offered the only alternative to fighting through overwhelming odds. "Can you make it?" Eliza had asked the old warrior, who was already struggling to remain upright. "The path will hold us because it must," he'd replied with quiet certainty. "When the need is great and the heart is pure, the earth itself becomes an ally to those who walk in harmony with the ancient ways." The traverse along the hidden ledge had been the most terrifying experience of Eliza's life. A nightmare journey where every step could be her last, and the slightest mistake would send her tumbling into the abyss. The path was barely wide enough for a horse's hooves, with loose rock that scattered into canyon depths at the slightest disturbance. Each pebble that fell echoing off walls like a gunshot that might alert their enemies. Old Crow had led the way, despite his weakness, his intimate knowledge of terrain allowing him to find secure footing where others would have seen only blank stone and certain death. His movements were careful and deliberate, each step tested before committing his full weight, breathing labored but steady as he'd guided them along a path that existed more in memory and faith than visible reality. Behind them, Morton's men had gradually realized their quarry had vanished like smoke. But by the time they discovered the alternative route, it had been too late to organize effective pursuit. The ledge would only accommodate single-file movement, making it impossible for large groups to follow quickly, while treacherous footing made haste potentially fatal, even for experienced climbers. But the effort had cost Old Crow dearly, draining reserves of strength that were already dangerously depleted. By the time they'd reached safety on the far side of the canyon, he'd been barely conscious, his breathing so shallow that each inhalation seemed like it might be his last. Blood had begun to appear at the corners of his mouth, a sign that his condition was deteriorating beyond what will and determination could overcome. "Not much farther now?" Orenda had said, supporting his uncle, while Eliza had examined the old warrior with growing alarm. Old Crow's eyes had opened at mention of their destination, focusing with desperate intensity on distant peaks that represented home sanctuary, fulfillment of promises made to ancestors who watched from the spirit world. "Can see it," he'd whispered, voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "Can see. Home hills. The drums are calling. Stronger now, like thunder that speaks the names of all who have gone before." And indeed, the sound of hide drums had grown stronger as they'd approached Thunder Mesa, their rhythm carrying across the morning air like a heartbeat that connected the living with ancestors who watched from sacred places. The drums spoke of honor and sacrifice, of promises kept and duties fulfilled, of the eternal cycle that connected all generations in an unbroken chain of memory and obligation. But between them and safety lay one final obstacle: Copper Gulch, where Pike's illegal mining operation scarred the earth with industrial greed and systematic theft, a wound in the landscape that spoke of values that placed profit above honor and exploitation above stewardship. The approach to Copper Gulch required nerves of steel and the kind of desperate cunning that came from having no alternatives except success or death. The illegal mining operation sprawled across a natural depression between two mesas like a carbuncle on the Earth's surface, its smoke-belching smelters and industrial machinery creating a hellscape of noise, fire-poisonous fumes that could be smelled for miles and heard even farther. What they'd thought was simple ore theft had actually been industrial mining on a massive scale. With hydraulic fed by a small headgate and wooden sluice from an upstream creek equipment that could wash away entire hillside steam-powered crushers that worked around the clock and processing facilities that could handle tons of raw material every day. The profits from this illegal extraction had been enormous, easily enough to finance political corruption on a territorial scale, while providing resources for the kind of private army Pike had assembled. But more ominously, they discovered the staging area for Pike's planned destruction of Devil's Tooth, the geological formation that held back spring snowmelt and prevented the entire Thunder Mesa Basin from being scoured clean by annual floods. Crates of dynamite, coils of fuse wire, and boxes of blasting caps had been arranged with military precision, while teams of experienced miners had worked to load explosives onto pack animals that could navigate rough trail to the target site. The artificial flood Pike was planning would appear to be a natural disaster, a tragic consequence of unusually heavy snowfall and geological instability that no one could have predicted or prevented. The destruction would clear the entire basin of inconvenient populations while providing Pike with a blank slate for development, according to his own vision of progress and profit. But their infiltration of the mining complex had been discovered when a guard dog had caught their scent and begun barking furiously, its alarm raising every man in the compound within minutes. The entire complex had come alive with shouting voices and bobbing lanterns, as Pike's security force had organized systematic search for intruders who might have seen too much. This way. Orenda had whispered, leading them between towering ore crushers and steam-powered machinery that provided cover, but also created a maze where they could easily become trapped. The industrial noise had been deafening, making communication difficult and masking the sound of approaching footsteps until enemies were almost within reach. The running battle through the mining complex had been fought in conditions that tested every lesson they'd learned about survival and cooperation. Steam pipes had burst when struck by bullets, sending scalding clouds across their path, while damaged steam-powered equipment had created sparking hazards that could have electrocuted the unwary. During the fighting, Old Crow had proven that a warrior's instincts never faded, even when the body that housed them was failing beyond repair. When Morton had appeared in their path with a shotgun raised to cut them down, the old Lakota had thrown his knife with deadly accuracy, the blade taking the corrupt deputy in the shoulder and spinning him around before he could fire. But the effort had finally broken what remained of Old Crow's strength, using up reserves that had been sustaining him through sheer force of will. He'd collapsed after the knife throw, blood frothing from his lips as his damaged lungs had finally reached the limits of what they could endure. Eliza and Orenda had carried him between them to a defensive position behind an overturned ore cart. But it had been clear that the old warrior was entering his final battle against an enemy that could not be defeated through courage or skill. Cannot make it much farther, he'd admitted as they'd helped him into shelter of fallen machinery, voice barely audible, but carrying absolute honesty about his condition. But close enough now. Can see. the sacred places where the spirits of my fathers dance in the wind. It was then that the most unexpected ally had appeared, Dr. Franklin emerging from the shadows with his medical bag, and an expression that suggested he'd been expecting their arrival. But this wasn't the gentle frontier physician they'd known. This man moved with military bearing and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Get him inside quickly," Franklin had commanded as they'd approached with Old Crow barely conscious in Orenda's arms. "That shoulder wound is infected, and the pneumonia is worse than when I examined him before." The medical examination that had followed had revealed disturbing inconsistencies that had cast everything they'd thought they knew about Franklin into doubt. The shoulder wound, he'd determined after careful examination, hadn't been caused by a rifle bullet fired during their running battle with Morton's men, as they had assumed. This was done by someone he trusted. Franklin had said after examining the wound under his magnifying glass. Someone who got close enough to press the barrel against his shirt before pulling the trigger. The powder burns prove close contact, and the angle suggests the shooter was standing beside him rather than across from him. But even as they'd absorbed this shocking revelation about betrayal within their circle, Franklin had begun to reveal his true identity through actions rather than words. From his hidden arsenal, he'd produced military-grade weapons and ammunition that had transformed their desperate situation into something approaching a fair fight. "I've been preparing for this confrontation for months," he'd explained while distributing rifles and cartridges with efficiency that spoke of extensive planning. "Federal forces are en route, but we need to hold this position until they arrive. The evidence you're carrying combined with what I've gathered during my investigation will be enough to bring down the entire conspiracy if we can survive long enough to deliver it to honest authorities." Only then had he produced his own identification papers, documents that identified him as Colonel Franklin Morrison, United States War Department, Special Detachment operating under direct orders from the War Department to investigate reports of foreign infiltration and seditious conspiracy in the territorial mining districts. "I've been working undercover for the past 18 months. He'd explained his entire manner, having changed from frontier physician to professional special investigator, gathering evidence about British attempts to establish economic colonies on American soil through a combination of legal manipulation, political corruption, and, when necessary, mass murder. But before they could fully process these revelations, the sound of approaching hoofbeats had announced the arrival of Pike's forces in overwhelming numbers. Through the way station's grimy windows, they'd seen at least 20 riders surrounding the crumbling adobe structure led by Blackjack Sloan himself, with his arm in a sling but his gun hand still steady. "Surrender the evidence and come out with your hands visible," Sloan had called from outside. "Mr. Pike is prepared to offer terms for your cooperation, but his patience ain't unlimited." What followed had been the most intense combat any of them had experienced, with professional gunmen attacking a fortified position held by determined defenders who had nothing left to lose except each other, and the evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. The way station's adobe walls had provided some protection from rifle fire, but Pike's men had brought explosives that had blown holes in their defenses and forced them to fall back to secondary positions. During the height of the battle, when it seemed their position might be overrun by sheer weight of numbers, Blackjack Sloan had made an unexpected decision that had changed the entire character of the conflict. Instead of continuing to follow Pike's orders, he'd turned his guns on Pike's other lieutenants in a betrayal that had been as sudden as it was devastating. "I've got no quarrel with you people," Sloan had called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "Pike promised me payment that never came, land that turned out to belong to someone else, and protection from law that was worth nothing when federal agents started asking questions." The humiliation he'd suffered at Devil's Backbone when Pike had publicly sided with Morton and questioned his independence had clearly festered during the subsequent pursuit. Combined with Pike's failure to deliver on his promises, It had created a perfect storm of resentment that finally boiled over into open rebellion. The revelation that Black Jack had decided to switch sides had been as shocking as it was welcome, providing them with additional firepower at the crucial moment when their ammunition was running low and their position seemed increasingly untenable. With his intimate knowledge of Pike's operations and his influence over many of the hired guns, his betrayal had effectively crippled Pike's military capabilities. "What do you want?" Franklin had asked from their fortified position rifle trained on the outlaw leader, while he'd considered the implications of this unexpected development. "Safe passage out of the territory," Sloan had replied. "And maybe a chance to set some things right before I disappear into Mexico or Colorado, where Pike's reach ain't quite so long." The alliance with Black Jack had been uneasy, but effective, providing them with the additional firepower they'd needed to hold their position until federal reinforcements had arrived in the form of Captain Morrison's cavalry troop. When the professional soldiers had finally appeared on the horizon, with their guidons snapping in the wind and their sabers gleaming in the sunlight, Pike's remaining forces had scattered rather than face trained military units in open combat. But Pike himself had proven as slippery as his reputation suggested, disappearing from the battlefield before he could be captured and making his way toward Copper Gulch, where the demolition charges for the Devil's Tooth operation were still waiting to be triggered. If he couldn't maintain control of the territory through legal manipulation and political corruption, he was prepared to destroy it, rather than allow others to benefit from resources he'd tried to steal. The drums of Thunder Mesa had grown louder as federal forces, Lakota warriors, and frontier settlers converged on Copper Gulch for the final confrontation with Pike's conspiracy, their rhythm carrying across the morning air like a heartbeat that connected all those who had chosen to stand against corruption and injustice. From every canyon and hidden draw surrounding the industrial complex, Old Crow's people had emerged like spirits materialized from red stone itself, their faces painted with sacred symbols and their weapons ready for battle. Manawa had led the main force of Lakota warriors, his war lance decorated with eagle feathers that danced in the wind as he'd guided his spotted pony down from the mesa rim with the grace of someone who had been born to warfare. Behind him had ridden 20 of the finest warriors from Old Crow's bandmen who'd grown up hearing stories of their war leader's courage and who'd come to ensure that his final journey ended with honor. But they hadn't been alone in their determination to see justice done. From the southern approaches, Hugh Camden had appeared with a mixed force of homesteaders and small ranchers' men who'd finally decided that they'd rather die fighting than live under Pike's brutal dominion for another day. Their weapons had been a mixture of military surplus rifles, hunting guns, and agricultural tools pressed into service as weapons of war. But their determination had been absolute. The weather had been building since dawn, starting with scattered clouds that had gradually thickened into the kind of storm front that could transform tactical situations in minutes. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by rumble of thunder that spoke of torrential rains and flash floods that could turn dry arroyos into raging torrents. The initial exchange of gunfire had erupted when Pike's sentries had spotted movement among boulder fields and had fired warning shots that echoed off canyon walls. Within seconds, the entire perimeter had erupted in violence. As both sides had opened up with everything they possessed, the sound of rifle fire echoing and re-echoing, until it seemed like the mountains were screaming with rage. Eliza had found herself pressed against a slab of red sandstone with bullets chipping fragments from rock around her, the tobacco tin containing Pike's incriminating evidence clutched against her chest like a talisman. But this time, she hadn't been content to simply take cover and wait for others to determine her fate. Grabbing a fallen rifle from one of Pike's wounded men, she'd begun returning fire with accuracy that surprised even herself. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Orenda had shouted over the cacophony of rifle fire, his Spencer booming as he dropped 2 more of Pike's men with shots that spoke of years of practice. "Farm life," she'd replied grimly, working the lever action to chamber another round. Coyotes, wolves, men who wouldn't take no for an answer. You learn to hit what you aim at when missing means losing everything you've worked for. The battle had raged with intensity that transformed the peaceful morning into a scene from the worst nightmares of civil warfare, with professional gunmen and desperate civilians exchanging fire across terrain that provided limited cover and no mercy for the careless or unlucky. Steam pipes had burst when struck by bullets, sending scalding clouds across the battlefield that had forced combatants on both sides to seek new positions. The Lakota warriors had possessed tactical advantages developed through generations of warfare against better armed and more numerous foes' skills that had been honed through countless battles. Using their superior horsemanship, they'd created mobile fire teams that had struck at Pike's positions and withdrawn before concentrated return fire could be brought to bear, while their intimate knowledge of terrain had allowed them to establish fields of fire that commanded key approaches to the industrial complex. But Pike's forces had rallied quickly under the leadership of professional military advisors whose presence confirmed the international dimensions of the conspiracy they were fighting. The foreign officers had proven their worth by coordinating defensive fire that had forced the attacking warriors to take cover among the maze of processing equipment, while their knowledge of European military tactics had helped them establish secondary defensive positions. The decisive moment had come when Hugh Camden's 16-year-old son David had managed to reach one of Pike's steam-powered ore crushers and had jammed its machinery with a crowbar, causing a catastrophic failure that had sent fragments of cast iron spinning through the air like shrapnel. The explosion had been spectacular and devastating, creating a gap in Pike's defensive perimeter that had allowed the attacking forces to pour through in a concentrated assault. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. David Camden had been caught in the explosion. He'd caused his body torn by flying metal and scalding steam. The sight of the boy's sacrifice had galvanized the attacking forces, while simultaneously demonstrating the price that would be paid by anyone who stood against Pike's industrial empire. It was during this phase that nature had intervened in the battle with devastating effect, as the storm that had been building all morning had finally unleashed its fury. The first drops of rain had been followed within minutes by a torrential downpour that had turned dust to mud and made footing treacherous. Lightning had split the sky with blinding intensity, followed by thunder that had drowned out the sound of gunfire. But worse than the rain had been the flash flood that had roared down from the mountains, turning the normally dry creek bed beside the mining complex into a raging torrent that had swept away everything in its path. The flood had been a preview of what Pike had planned for the entire Thunder Mesa Basin, a demonstration of the destructive power of water channeled by human engineering for purposes of greed and political control. Eliza had made her desperate decision during this phase, leaving the relative safety of their defensive position to pursue Pike toward the storage chamber, where he kept the explosives for the Devil's Tooth operation. The approach had been a nightmare journey through industrial machinery that had been turned into an obstacle course by the ongoing battle with broken steam pipes releasing clouds of scalding vapor and damaged steam-powered equipment creating sparking hazards. The flooding had caught her halfway to her destination, turning the normally level factory floor into a maze of rushing water and floating debris that could crush bones or drag her under with equal ease. She'd found herself fighting not just Pike's gunmen, but the flood itself, struggling to keep her footing while debris-laden water had swirled around her waist and threatened to sweep her away toward crushing machinery that continued to operate despite surrounding chaos. The most terrifying moment had come when a section of damaged roofing had collapsed into the floodwater, creating a temporary dam that had caused the water level to rise with alarming speed. Eliza had found herself trapped between a wall of rising water and Pike's gunmen, with escape routes disappearing as quickly as she could identify them. But Orenda had refused to abandon her entering the flooded complex, despite obvious danger to himself, and fighting his way through debris-laden water to reach her position. His rescue had been complicated by a severe shoulder wound that had left his left arm nearly useless. but he'd compensated with the kind of tactical thinking that had made him a respected warrior. Using his knowledge of warfare, he'd turned the flood to their advantage by creating a diversion that had drawn Pike's men away from Eliza's position. By deliberately causing a steam pipe to rupture in a different section of the complex, he'd created the impression that the main assault was coming from that direction, while actually providing cover for their real objective. The confrontation with Pike had taken place in a storage chamber filled with enough dynamite to level half the canyon, where a single spark could have obliterated everyone within a half-mile radius. Pike had been standing beside a detonator, connected to charges already placed throughout the complex, his finger poised over the trigger that would have brought down the canyon walls in catastrophic avalanche designed to bury all evidence of his crimes. "Miss Hartwell," he'd said with the same cultured politeness he'd shown during his visits to the work camp, though his white gloves had been stained with blood, and his city clothes had been torn by his flight through industrial wreckage. "How thoughtful of you to join me for the final act of our little drama. I do hope you've enjoyed the performance so far. It's been educational." Eliza had replied, her hand steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The tobacco tin felt warm against her chest, its contents representing the only hope of justice she'd ever known. Pike had smiled at her response, an expression that held no warmth despite its apparent politeness. "Educational indeed. Tell me, my dear, where exactly did you think you were taking that evidence? To whom did you imagine you could present your little collection of stolen property? To someone with the authority to stop you." She'd said, though uncertainty had begun to creep into her voice. "To the federal surveyor who's supposed to be investigating this territory." Pike's laughter had been genuine, rich with amusement that seemed to spring from some private joke that only he understood. "Oh, my dear Miss Hartwell, you don't understand the situation at all, do you?" He'd reached into his vest pocket and withdrawn an official document, its government seals and formal letterhead clearly visible even in the dim light of the storage chamber. "You thought you were running toward justice." Pike had continued his voice, taking on a mocking tone that cut through her like a blade. "You believed there was some honest federal official who would listen to your accusations and act on your precious evidence." The document had rustled as he'd unfolded it, revealing text that made Eliza's blood run cold. "I am justice in this territory, Miss Hartwell. I am the federal surveyor appointed by Congress itself to assess the mineral resources of this region. Every mine, every claim, every acre of land, it all falls under my jurisdiction." The revelation had hit her like a physical blow, the understanding that her desperate flight had been toward the man she'd been fleeing from. "The charred document you found in my office," Pike had continued with obvious satisfaction, "was meant to be destroyed. But it seems my clerk was careless with the fire. No matter, it served its purpose by giving you hope, by making you believe there was someone who could help you. Hope, my dear, is such a useful tool for controlling people's actions." The scope of his deception had been staggering, the understanding that every move she'd made had been anticipated. Every hope she'd harbored had been carefully manipulated. Pike had known exactly where she would try to go, exactly what she would try to do with the evidence she'd stolen. Her desperate flight across the territory had been nothing more than an elaborate game designed to amuse him while he'd prepared his final moves. But even as despair had threatened to overwhelm her, Eliza had realized that Pike's arrogance might also be his weakness. He was so confident in his control of the situation that he was taking time to gloat, to savor his victory over someone he considered beneath his notice. And while he talked, she could hear sounds that suggested the battle outside was turning in their favor. The distinctive boom of Orenda's Spencer, the war cries of Lakota warriors, the disciplined volleys of federal troops. "You may be the surveyor," She'd said, her voice steadier than she'd thought possible. "But you're not the only authority in this territory. Those drums we've been hearing, they're calling warriors who remember when this land belonged to people who understood its true value. And those federal troops I can hear outside, they're going to want to know why their appointed surveyor has been murdering civilians and stealing resources that belong to the United States government." Pike's confident expression had begun to waver as he'd studied the distant dust clouds more carefully, his expertise in reading military formations telling him that these were professional soldiers rather than the frontier gunmen he'd been expecting. "Those aren't my men," he'd said slowly, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time since she'd known him. The approaching force had indeed been different. A full troop of United States cavalry under the command of Captain James Morrison, accompanied by federal marshals bearing warrants for the arrest of everyone involved in Pike's conspiracy, and backed by the authority of the United States government. At their head had ridden Colonel Franklin Morrison, his medical bag replaced by military equipment, and his frontier physician's clothes exchanged for the blue uniform of a federal special investigator. But the arrival of federal forces had triggered Pike's most desperate gambit as he'd attempted to detonate the explosive charges that would have destroyed the evidence and eliminated the witnesses who could testify against him. His finger had closed on the detonator trigger, just as the ceiling had begun to collapse from structural damage caused by the flood and the ongoing battle creating a race against time that would determine whether justice or destruction would prevail. The explosion that had followed had been visible for 50 miles in every direction, a pillar of fire and smoke that had marked the end of the most successful foreign infiltration attempt in American territorial history. But the blast had been controlled rather than catastrophic, the result of Orenda's sabotage of the fusing system during their earlier infiltration of the complex. Instead of bringing down the entire canyon, the explosion had been contained to the storage area itself, destroying Pike's evidence while leaving the surrounding structures intact. Pike himself had perished in the explosion. He'd tried to trigger his body consumed by fires he'd intended to use as weapons against innocent people. His death had been neither heroic nor tragic, simply the inevitable result of choices that had led him step by step toward destruction of his own making. Old Crow had died peacefully as the smoke had cleared, and federal marshals had secured the scene, passing away, with the sound of victory celebrations echoing from the surrounding mesas, and the satisfaction of knowing that his final battle had been won not through violence alone, but through the triumph of truth over deception and justice over corruption. His last words had been spoken in Lakota, but Orenda had translated them for Eliza. "The sacred places are safe. The promises have been kept. The young ones will remember that the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth." 2 years after the battle at Copper Gulch, spring had returned to Thunder Mesa with a glory that had seemed to celebrate not just the changing seasons, but the transformation of human relationships that had taken root in the high country. Wild flowers had carpeted the meadows between the sacred stones, while streams had run full and clear from snowmelt that had promised abundant water for all the territory's diverse communities. Eliza had stood at the edge of Old Crow's burial cave, a small bundle of prairie roses in her hands and contentment in her heart that had been earned through suffering sacrifice, the kind of love that had grown strong in the crucible of shared struggle. The flowers had been the old warrior's favorites she'd learned from the women of his band, and she'd continued the practice of bringing fresh ones whenever her duties as territorial liaison had brought her to the sacred mesa. "Good morning, Uncle," she'd said quietly, using the term of respect that had become natural through years of practice. "Thought you'd want to hear about how things are progressing down in the valley." The sound of approaching footsteps had made her turn, and she'd smiled to see Orenda climbing the path with 2 steaming cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of a man whose work had gone well. His shoulder had healed from the wounds sustained during their desperate journey, though it still ached during changes in weather and the scar on his face had faded to a thin white line that had given his features character rather than marking him as damaged by violence. Talking to Uncle again, he'd asked with gentle humor that had become one of his most endearing characteristics, settling beside her on the stone ledge that had overlooked the transformed valley below. He was always a good listener. She'd replied, accepting the coffee with gratitude of someone who'd learned to appreciate simple pleasures after experiencing genuine hardship. Still is, I believe. Sometimes I think I can hear him offering advice about the challenges we're facing. As they'd sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the mesa, while feeling warmth spread across the stone where they'd rested, Orenda had produced a worn leather journal from his pack, Old Crow's personal record of his life's experiences, written in a mixture of Lakota pictographs and English text that had captured decades of wisdom about leadership courage, the price of standing for principle in a world that often rewarded compromise and corruption. Uncle left this for future generations. Orenda had explained as he'd opened the journal to its final entry, written during their desperate flight from Pike's forces years earlier. His last words to those who would come after him. But there's something else, something he wanted specifically for you. The entry had been brief but profound, written in English that had carried the formal cadence of treaty negotiations and the emotional weight of a dying man's final testimony. But at the end, in different ink that suggested it had been added later, was a personal message that had made Eliza's breath catch with surprise and emotion. To the white woman who chose honor over safety, courage over comfort. You are my daughter in all ways that matter. The blood that flows in your veins may have come from distant ancestors, but the spirit that guides your choices was born from the same source that has always protected our people. Take this knowledge as my gift. You belong to this land, and this land belongs to you, not because of papers or treaties, but because you have watered it with your tears and defended it with your life. Teach your children to remember that worth is measured not by the color of skin or the place of birth, but by the choices made when choosing is difficult, and the path ahead is shrouded in darkness. The discovery that Old Crow had considered her his adopted daughter had been overwhelming, carrying implications about belonging and family that went far beyond anything she'd dared to hope for during their desperate journey. In the margins of the journal, he'd included detailed instructions about sacred sites and seasonal ceremonies, knowledge that was normally passed down through blood relatives, but which he'd chosen to share with someone who'd earned the right through actions rather than ancestry. But there was more. Tucked between the journal's pages was a detailed map drawn in Old Crow's careful hand, showing the location of a hidden valley where his people had cached supplies and sacred objects during times of persecution. The valley contained not just material wealth, though there was silver and turquoise in quantities that could ensure prosperity for generations, but something more valuable. A library of pictographs and oral traditions that preserved knowledge going back to the beginning of human presence in this country. He wanted you to have guardianship of the sacred places. Orenda had explained, his voice thick with emotion, as he'd studied the map that represented his uncle's final gift to the woman who'd become his family through choice rather than chance. Not ownership in the white man's sense, but responsibility for ensuring that the knowledge is preserved and passed on to those who will use it wisely. Their marriage had taken place the following spring, conducted according to both white and Lakota traditions, in a ceremony that had symbolized the kind of cultural cooperation Old Crow had envisioned before his death. Judge Blackwood, who'd replaced Pike's corrupted territorial officials, had performed the legal formalities, while Old Crow's nephew Menawa had conducted the traditional blessing that had joined their spirits according to ancient custom. The wedding celebration had lasted 3 days and had included guests from every community in the territory, making it as much a symbol of regional unity as a personal milestone. Federal officials had attended alongside Lakota war leaders, while Mexican vaqueros had shared meals with Chinese merchants and German immigrants in displays of multicultural cooperation that would have been unthinkable during Pike's regime. As they'd walked hand in hand down the trail toward home, Eliza had felt the kind of deep satisfaction that came from knowing that their struggles had created something larger and more lasting than their individual lives. The frightened widow who'd fled Pike's work camp had been transformed into a woman who'd found her purpose, her people, and her place in a world that had been made better through the simple act of keeping a promise to a dying warrior. Thunder Mesa had stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, eternal and unchanging, a guardian watching over communities that had learned to call each other family. And in the sacred cave, high on its eastern face, an old warrior had slept peacefully, knowing that his final battle had been won not through violence, but through the courage of ordinary people who'd chosen to do extraordinary things when the choice was difficult and dangerous. The territory that had once been divided by fear-hatred, the greed of corrupt men, had become a place where children grew up speaking multiple languages, where families from different cultures shared resources and knowledge, and where the measure of a person's worth was determined by their character rather than their ancestry. It wasn't perfect, no human community ever could be, but it was proof that Old Crow's vision of a better world was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict and justice over profit. In the distance, Thunder Mesa stood guard over it all, and in the hearts of those who'd learned its lessons, the drums of Old Crow's final calling continued to beat with the rhythm of hope, honor, the unbreakable bonds that tied souls together across all the barriers that smaller minds might try to build.